So my name is Mary Ganapole. I'm the Southern Arizona lead for Arizona End of Life Options. In case you're not aware of this, we are supported by two national groups, Death with Dignity and Compassion and Choices. I always like to say that because we get some nice support from them. They attend our steering committee meetings and we get good input from them also. I entitled this MAID 101. I'm going to talk about just very briefly the current end-of-life options for Arizona residents. Then I'm going to get into more detail of the definition of medical aid in dying, the qualifications and the safeguards of the law, and then talk a little bit about what's happening in Arizona. I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions afterwards. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly and then leave time for questions. So briefly, the current end-of-life options for Arizona residents. Number one, seek all treatments, full speed ahead. Some people call this the medicalization of dying. Our Dr. Tom Finch of our group goes into this quite extensively. He has a lot of experience and he has a great webinar on this. Another choice is to discontinue or withdraw treatment. Palliative care and hospice is always an option. Voluntary stopping eating and drinking, and palliative sedation. I'm not going to go into each of these because we have separate webinars that go into all our choices at end of life in great detail. What I really want to talk about is this option, which is not available in Arizona, medical aid in dying, sometimes called death with dignity. That's the preferred terminology. You'll hear the opposition calling this physician-assisted suicide or physician-assisted death, and I'll get into that a little bit in more detail. What about euthanasia? That always comes up. This is not euthanasia. We're not talking about euthanasia. Euthanasia is illegal in all 50 states. It's unlikely to be considered here in the US in the future. The difference between euthanasia and medical aid in dying is that euthanasia is something that a third party does to a patient, like a doctor, giving an injection. So it's really important that you understand that medical aid in dying is not euthanasia. A lot of people just use the two expressions interchangeably. I've seen a button that says, "Let me die like a dog." Animals are put to sleep, they're euthanized. In the United States, where medical aid in dying is legal, it's not called euthanasia because it has to be self-administered. So if you walk away from one thing tonight, please understand that we're not talking about euthanasia. So what exactly is medical aid in dying? Here's the elevator speech, and I'm going to go into each one of these details. It's a medical practice in which a terminally ill, mentally capable adult with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live can obtain medication prescribed by their doctor to be self-administered to die peacefully if and when they choose. It'd be really great in learning to talk about medical aid in dying with your loved ones, with friends, with neighbors, if you could sort of have it so that this definition kind of rolls off your tongue. So we're going to break that down. It's a medical practice. I like to stress this because the VW bus on the left is what Dr. Kevorkian used. And he's often brought up in discussions about medical aid in dying. And again, he was doing euthanasia. He euthanized 130 patients, some out of this VW bus. So again, we're not talking about what Dr. Kevorkian was doing. We're talking about a medical practice for terminally ill adults. So 63% of the people who use medical aid in dying are dying of cancer. 14% of neurological disorders like ALS and Parkinson's, cardiovascular disease, and respiratory disease, and then some small percentage of other. They have to be a mentally capable adult. Unfortunately, this rules out people with dementia. Adults is over 18 years of age, with the majority being over 65. If there's any question about someone's mental capacity, then it triggers a mental health evaluation. and they have to have 6 months or less to live. 90% of the people who use MAID are enrolled in hospice. It's not a requirement, but when they're writing these laws, they figured the best, since hospice is a Medicare benefit for people with 6 months or less to live, they would use this milestone of a 6 month or less prognosis to qualify for medical aid in dying. And it's a medication prescribed by their doctor. So this is a combination of various drugs from a compound pharmacy. It's a formula that's been fine-tuned over the years, depending on the availability of drugs and the stats and data that comes in from the use of these drugs. There's this group in California, American Clinicians Academy for Medical Aid in Dying, which is sort of leading the discussion on what the best combination of drugs is. So they're getting feedback from all the clinicians who are using a particular formula that they've come up with. And it's been fine-tuned over a couple of years. Now, this website, acamaid.org, has a couple of very good webinars that go into great detail about the particular drugs and how they're working. We don't need to go into those details today. So I'm just giving an overview. It needs to be self-administered. So this again is why medical aid in dying is not referred to as euthanasia. You can't have assistance from others. There can't be coercion from others. There's alternatives for people who have trouble swallowing, where it can be injected through a feeding tube or a rectal catheter. The drugs work in a matter of minutes. You're put into a deep sleep, and then you die in a matter of anywhere from minutes to hours, depending on what your terminal condition is. And of course, the patient can change their mind at any time, if and when they choose. So that's an important part of the conversation, because this is patient-driven, patient decision. And here's an interesting statistic. There's 30% of the people who go through all the steps to qualify for medical aid in dying end up not taking the medication. They might feel better that they have it, just in case they need it. So it gives them peace of mind at the end. So that's the basic definition: a medical practice in which a terminally ill, mentally capable adult with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live can obtain medication prescribed by their doctor to be self-administered to die peacefully if and when they choose. So we've already talked about that it's not euthanasia. I'm going to talk about briefly why it's also not called assisted suicide or physician-assisted suicide. This is not just the idea of the Right to Die movement. Among others, these 5 prestigious medical associations also have written policies that it's not to be called suicide. These 2 groups on the right, American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine and the American Academy of Family Physicians, have a neutral position on medical aid in dying, but they also have a policy saying it's not to be called suicide. And another group, American College of Legal Medicine, also rejects the term suicide. It's right in a brief they filed in the Supreme Court, and they adopted a formal resolution in 2008. Here's an interesting side-by-side difference between medical aid in dying and suicide. So we have a terminal diagnosis with a mental capacity. Patients often with 6 months to live, diagnosis of less than 6 months to live, really want to live every day to the fullest. They plan these end-of-life options with their family and friends. The death is gentle and there's a normal grieving after the loss. It's a family decision along with the patient and the doctor. And the law actually will specify specifically that medical aid in dying is not euthanasia, mercy killing, suicide, assisted suicide, elder abuse, or homicide. There's actually a law in the books in Arizona for assisted suicide. So the law as worded, will say specifically, medical aid in dying is not assisted suicide. So there's some additional requirements. There's 2 clinicians that have to confirm the patient's qualifications and attending and a consulting. I put provider here instead of physician because there's a couple of states where it's a medical doctor plus a physician's assistant, or a nurse practitioner can be the second provider. They must confirm that there's no coercion or undue influence, and the patient must be a resident of the state where it's legal. I have an asterisk on that because just this year, a doctor on the Oregon-Washington border filed a lawsuit to challenge the residency requirement in Oregon, and he won the lawsuit. So many states now are looking at changing their law so that a residency is not required. But of course, if you go to Oregon, you still need 2 doctors in Oregon, an attending and a consulting. You still have to have less than 6 months to live. You still have to have all the other qualifications, but you don't have to establish residency. There's additional safeguards with oral requests, written requests, waiting periods, written statements. These vary state by state, but each state has their own version of these additional safeguards. And everything is documented in the medical records. Other provisions, this always comes up. What about insurance policies? Wills, contracts, insurance policies, annuities are not affected by a person choosing medical aid in dying. This is also written right into the law. And the cause of death on the death certificate is shown as the underlying terminal illness, which is standard in other end-of-life options. So for example, this information is taken from a really great document from Compassionate Choices, by the way. And they use this example. Doctors don't list disconnecting the ventilator or suffocation as the cause of death for a person who had a massive stroke and was ultimately removed from life support. They list stroke or cerebrovascular accident. Likewise, when a doctor would list cancer on a death certificate, if someone dies in palliative sedation, they wouldn't list physician-administered drug overdose. So just like other end-of-life options, the cause of death shown on the death certificate is their terminal disease. So who can opt out of medical aid in dying? Basically everyone. Doctors, nurses, hospice workers may opt out at any time. This is sometimes called a conscience clause. It's referred to as a conscience clause by the lawmakers sometimes, or right in the law. Patients also, of course, can change their mind at any time. And also, as part of the law, all parties are protected from criminal and civil liabilities if the law is followed to the letter. There's multiple reasons for choosing medical aid in dying. We have many years of Oregon to look at because it's been legal there since 1998. So they have lots of data. They also have, of course, data from all the other states that have the law. And these are the main reasons. The interesting thing about pain being down at 26%, that may seem a little bit surprising. And Compassionate Choices mentions that it's often the doctors that check off the reasons for the patient picking medical aid in dying. So they might pick 2 or 3 of these reasons. And Compassionate Choices feels like pain is down at 26% because doctors often underestimate patients' pain, which I thought was interesting. I'm just going to go briefly over some misconceptions that are also reviewed by Compassionate Choices in this policy document. And you'll hear this in hearings for the law. The opposition will say, well, hospice can provide all the comfort, care, and patient and pain management that people need. We are very pro-hospice. Of course, 90% of the people who use medical aid in dying are enrolled in hospice. And they can provide, of course, comfort, care, and pain management. There are certain kinds of pain and certain kinds of end-of-life deaths that have breakthrough pain and the pain is often not controlled. So in addition to hospice, hospice and medical aid in dying are used in conjunction. Here's another misconception. They like to say insurance companies deny treatment in states that have medical aid in dying. Insurance companies deny coverage for a variety of reasons. It hasn't been shown really that they say in states that have medical aid in dying that they're denying treatment. If people are in hospice with less than 6 months to live, they're not pursuing expensive treatment anyway. So it's a really odd argument. You'll find if you look at what's happening in California, Kaiser Permanente is a very big insurance company, and they're very proactive and a big proponent of medical aid in dying. Here's another misconception, that the coroners will be inundated when the law passes. This was right in the voter handbook in Colorado. They said, what are we going to do with all the bodies? There'll be 10,000 bodies and we'll be just overwhelmed. This doesn't happen. Even in the states where it's been legal for many, many years, it's less than 1% of the people that qualify in the states where it's legal use medical aid in dying. So it's not a huge amount of people. I like to feel like if you're advocating for medical aid in dying, you're advocating for the people who maybe can't advocate for themselves. They're at the end of life, and it's really the most vulnerable, painful experience they're going through. So it's not a huge amount of people, but it's a very vulnerable population. Interestingly, the mere existence of medical aid in dying in a state improves end-of-life care. And they found this in Oregon. They've studied hospice, for example, in Oregon. They have studies where they look at overuse of hospice, underuse of hospice, and Oregon got just the right use of hospice, for example. And they think the reason why end-of-life care improves in these states across the board is because more doctors and nurses are talking to their patients about their end-of-life options. Here's another misconception, that family members coerce terminally ill loved ones. This just isn't happening in the states where it's legal. Compassionate Choices says there's plenty of other ways to hasten death with fewer safeguards and liabilities, like over-medicating and under-medicating and elder abuse. But it doesn't really happen with medical aid in dying. It's far more likely that a family will be the ones wanting any and all measures to be taken to prolong life. And usually someone will ask about the Hippocratic Oath. And it's kind of a urban legend that the Hippocratic Oath is really even used that much anymore. And when you talk about first do no harm, some doctors feel that maybe allowing a patient to suffer is more harmful than not. So here's the states where medical aid in dying is legal currently. We have an asterisk next to Montana because they don't technically have a medical aid in dying law with all the safeguards and details that I've just gone over. They basically have a law that says they won't prosecute doctors for performing medical aid in dying, but it doesn't have any details on the safeguards. You can see after California passed in 2016, we had 5 states in 5 years. So there's a little bit of a momentum, with New Mexico being the most recent to pass last year. So what are the next states to pass a medical aid in dying law? There's about 20 states a year that propose medical aid in dying law. And many states have pro-medical aid in dying grassroots organizations like we do here in Arizona. And again, these 2 national groups support these efforts. I want to talk about Arizona for a minute. So these are photos from a Million Geyser March, the Capitol in Phoenix, back in 2006, 7, and 8, which is pretty amazing when you think that very few states had the law at that point. There was only Oregon and Washington that had the law. So they had 2 states, we have 10. So we should be able to get some momentum going here. Here's a couple more pictures of the people marching in Phoenix. So there was some polling done in Arizona in 2015. 56% of Arizonans supported medical aid in dying legislation. In 2017, there was a survey done of doctors, and 53% of Arizona physicians supported medical aid in dying. So we did a poll in January of 2022, 855 registered voters in Arizona. This is an ongoing survey that's done, and you can sort of buy a question to be added. We have a lot of details on our website about how that polling turned out. This was the question that was asked. I'm not going to read it. You can look it over. You can see it. It's very similar to the definition we went over earlier tonight. So in response to this question, people could answer they were somewhat supportive, strongly support, they were neutral, they're strongly opposed, or unsure. 60% of registered voters somewhat or strongly support the idea of a medical aid in dying law. And only 13, 14, 15% somewhat or strongly oppose. And the majority of voters in all other demographics also supported passing a medical aid in dying law. So the neutral and unsure was about 27%, and that's really the group I'm interested in reaching, are the people that didn't understand the question or just didn't feel like they understood the topic well enough to answer whether they supported it or opposed it. And we have tons of data. If you're into numbers and data, we have all the breakdown on our website of this particular survey that was done in January. So the legislation introduced so far from 2003, we do propose a bill, 8 Senate bills, 12 House bills, and 0 number of times that these bills have advanced out of committee. I always like to point this out when I'm doing tabling, because people say, well, why don't you just, propose a bill? And that's been going on for quite some time. There's quite a quite a history of the Right to Die movement in Arizona. These are the various names that have been used by groups here in Arizona. And now, since 2019, we have Arizona end-of-life options. So if you're interested in passing a medical aid in dying law, what I really hoped for this webinar would be that it would just give you an overview of the law, the safeguards, the parameters, so that you'd feel comfortable talking about what we're doing here in Arizona. You can go to our website. We have lots of great webinars. We have a great monthly newsletter that'll give you information on exactly what we're doing each month. And most importantly, join an action team. We have legislative action teams by each legislative district in Arizona. And we'll be using the action teams to email and phone our representatives when there's a bill proposed. And of course, we always take donations. We are fiscal sponsor is Death with Dignity in Portland. So any donations that go to us are through them. That's a 501c4. We're always looking for places where we can speak to groups. So if you have any ideas on groups we can speak to or tabling we can do, we have a contact page on our website. So thank you for joining us today.